this morning. Um, I am going to be preaching from Mark chapter 4, which is reading that Sue read out at the end there. And this morning I want to talk about hope. I don't know about for any of you, but for me, hope has felt like quite an elusive thing in this last year, hasn't it? Every time we pinned our hopes to something external, maybe being that 2021 was going to mark a return to normality, or the Christmas plans that we were assured would be unchanged, or maybe even that the first lockdown would only last 3 weeks. Whatever our assurances or plans that we've had that we've seen crumble in this last year, I'm sure that for most of us, or probably all of us, who some stage have faced disappointment. And I think in the process of that, most of us have realized by this stage that attaching our hopes to decisions of government or the predictability of a pandemic, or more generally even to the changeable nature of this season, is not really going to get us anywhere. And I think in response, we kind of have one of two options. The first is that we become a bit disillusioned and disengaged, kind of disconnect from things, from reality. Or the alternative is to decide to put our hope somewhere entirely different. And this morning we're looking at Mark chapter 4, as Sue read, and it's such a familiar passage to us, isn't it? In fact, so much so that even as we started reading it, I'm sure that you jumped to the conclusion because you knew what was going to happen at the end. And I just want to encourage us as we kind of walk through it together just now, you might want to have it open in front of you, to try and approach it fresh, try and approach it as if it's the first time you read it or heard it, and walk through the journey with the disciples and Jesus. And I want to talk about this. I think there's three perspectives from which we can look at this passage, three different ways that we can approach it. And I think all three build a full picture of how we can engage with it. And I think when we gather all three of these together and reflect on them, I think Jesus offers us hope in the midst of it. And I trust and pray that he offers hope afresh to each of us in this season as we read it. So we're going to look at those three perspectives. And those three perspectives are, first, how the disciples face the storm. And then second, how does Jesus face the storm? And then third, how do the disciples face Jesus? That's the three perspectives I'd like us to look at. And so we're going to dig into it together and look at that first perspective. How do the disciples face the storm? So as a bit of context, this passage in Mark's Gospel comes at the end of a fairly intensive day. Jesus has likely been standing on actually the boat that they're on right now in the sea. He's likely been standing on there all day, slightly off the shore, and speaking to the crowds that have gathered at the shorefront, teaching about the kingdom of God. He's exhausted, and he suggests to the disciples that they leave the crowds behind and cross the lake. And I don't know if you know some of the history and geography of the Sea of Galilee, but if you do, then you'll know that it's the lowest freshwater lake in the world, and it's surrounded by hilly countryside. And that local climate and the fact that it's so low means that often this sea can look pristine, so still, the most still lake that you would see with the hills reflecting off of the water. The kind of sea or lake that beckons you in for a swim, you know. But then also because of how this lake is situated, a storm can start with almost no warning. There's nothing to give you an idea that it's coming. And so what this was a previously calm sea can become quite treacherous. And that is what happens on this evening. The language used is a furious squall, but I wasn't really that up to nautical terms. I never really understood what that fully meant or grasped it properly. But what it means is I want you to imagine an intense, focused, sudden and violent windstorm. That's what's being described here. The extreme weather that they're traveling in. And I want you to continue to imagine this. They're part of their way into the journey. They're far away from the shore now. They're too far from their destination. And alongside that, it's night. So there's not any natural light to see where they are and how far they are from the destination. And so they're stuck. They're stuck at this point. In my early 20s, when I lived in Aberdeen, I lived beside a river called the River Don. And one day I decided to organize a bit of an adventure with my two flatmates. And so we bought what I looked online for the cheapest budget dinghies I could get hold of. And I managed to get 3 for about £5 each. And I thought, well, just in case they're not very good, I'll also buy some pool noodles, the kind of foam pool noodles, and some pirate hats to complete the look. and we'll travel down the river. So they all arrived after a couple of days, and I'll show you a picture of. Oh, is it possible for me to show a picture? So I keep going for now anyway. But effectively, they arrived, and they did not look anything like what they're supposed to online. In fact, I'm pretty sure that they were children's dinghies. So we had these 3 inflatable children's dinghies that definitely weren't fitted for adults to float. These pool noodles and pirate hats. And we set off down the river. And initially, it was quite like a lazy river, like one of those things in a resort, and you kind of just floating along, slightly sinking, but largely okay. And then we turned a bend, and the river started to pick up pace a little bit. And then we noticed what looked like the beginning of rapids coming up at the bottom. And suddenly our dinghy and pool noodle felt very ill-equipped for what we were coming up to face. But we were too far from the flat that we'd left, and we were too far from the car that we parked at the destination. So we didn't really have much of a choice. We're like, well, let's just see how we get on. Let's try going down those rapids. Just as we came to the edge of the rapids, there was a park on the side, and there's a group of kids who decided to stand and watch us. And just as we hit the start of the rapids, shouted, "You're all gonna die," which was very reassuring. Thankfully, we all survived, and it was shallow enough that when it got particularly bad, we could stand up. And it was actually quite a fun adventure. But that is not what's going on in this passage. The disciples weren't traveling on ill-equipped boats. In fact, 4 of the disciples were lifelong fishermen, and they'd navigated this lake for their livelihood. It was their family business. And the boats that they were on were built for use and fishing on this lake. So they weren't ill-equipped. And yet they are panicking. There's nothing melodramatic about it. There's nothing irrational or ill-planned. But they knew that fine well that this storm was too much for them, and actually it could kill them. They could drown. And with that context, looking from the disciples' point of view, looking at the storm, where is Jesus? He's having a nap. And when you realize that, the context, when you realize how dangerous this storm was, you kind of realize how crazy this story is, don't you? I mean, if nothing else, talk about a deep sleeper. And they managed to wake him up. And while they're shouting over this wind and waves, and they say to him, "Don't you care if we drown? Look at this storm." And these billows of wind are causing the whole boat to almost capsize, and waves are coming across the boat and drenching them with water. And they say to him over that noise, "Don't you care if we drown?" In the midst of this legitimate danger, Jesus is asleep. I wonder if any of us have felt a little bit like that in the last year. As we face this global pandemic, this global crisis, there's less security in our jobs, in our health, and we find ourselves more isolated than ever before. Maybe we've brought those feelings to God, that experience to God, and it might have felt like God is asleep. Maybe, if you're honest, you might have found yourself asking the same question that Jesus was asked by the disciples. Don't you care what's going on? Don't you care about this? I can't pretend to offer a robust theological answer if that has been your experience. But it does reassure me that what we find in Scripture is this exact scenario. The disciples are asking this question of Jesus. And it reminds me that this experience, this human experience throughout history, is that we have wrestled with this reality, that God often allows 2 things to coexist together, both chaos, storms, and also his presence. And often he doesn't immediately resolve that tension. In fact, when you look through scriptures, you see a number of examples of that happening. And so if you do find yourself here, if you have found yourself asking that question in the last little while, then I just want to reassure you that you're not alone. Not only are millions of others sitting here right now, throughout history, people have found themselves here, asking the question of God. And I just want to encourage you just for a few moments, if that is you, just to name it, if that's been your experience of this last year. You don't need to do it out loud. You can just acknowledge it in your head, or you could say to the person beside you, or you could write it down before God. But just name if that has been your experience. Don't pretend as if it hasn't. I think it's important for us to be honest before God with this. So just do that for a moment if that has been you. before we continue? I'll take a little drink. And what this passage does offer, if we find ourselves in this perspective, the disciples looking at the storm and asking these questions, is an important reminder that Jesus never leaves. No matter the fact that they find themselves in the midst of this storm, Jesus is still with them. He doesn't bail out of the boat. He doesn't disappear. And while his engagement with the storm might be unexpected, he never leaves them. And so I think we can gather from that don't mistake God's silence as his absence. Don't mistake God's silence for his absence. God is with you if you find yourself asking these questions in the midst of this. Take heart. Have hope. God is with you. He might not be responding in the way that you're expecting him to, but he is not absent or distant. So if this is the first perspective, as the disciples look at the storm, the first puzzle piece of the story, the second perspective to add in is, how does Jesus face this storm? I've got a question for you. Have you ever tried to sleep on a stormy boat crossing? Have you? There's a boat crossing that travels from Aberdeen to Shetland, and it takes 12 hours, and it's quite stormy seas often. And my wife Lindsay has family in Shetland, so she quite often took that boat journey as a child. And she says, and she could tell you herself, she was here, that if it's a rough travel, the one thing that you really want to do is sleep, but it's the very last thing you're able to do. And yet somehow, in the midst of this storm, Jesus is asleep. And at a very human level, we know it's because he's tired, because he's had a full day teaching. But as when we read this passage, when Jesus wakes up, it becomes clear quite quickly that there's another reason why he's able to sleep. See, this storm doesn't take him by surprise, and it doesn't cause him to fear. And to be honest, I'm quite glad that is the case. Aren't you? God isn't afraid of the storm, and it doesn't take him by surprise. God is not afraid of this storm, and it doesn't take him by surprise. A bit of an interesting fact for you. Throughout the Gospels, this is the only account that we know of that Jesus actually sleeps. Of course, we know that he sleeps at other points, but this is the only time it's actually written down. There's plenty of cases where we read of the disciples sleeping and Jesus being awake. But in the midst of this story is the only time we read of Jesus sleeping. But the tables turn when we get to Mark chapter 14 in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the disciples and Jesus find themselves in this lovely, pristine, quiet evening, looking over Jerusalem. They've had a long day and they're struggling to keep their eyes open. But Jesus is wide awake. He's sweating drops of blood in distress as he recognizes the importance of what is to come, and is deeply troubled as he comes before the Father, preparing to give up his life to save us. And he keeps coming back to the disciples and finds them asleep and wakes them to say, "Couldn't you stay awake with me for 1 hour?" You see how the tables are turned there? Jesus is awake when it matters the most. And there's this worship leader called Jason Upton, who's an American worship leader. Some of you might have heard of him. And he preached in this passage, and I heard it a couple of years ago. And what he said, he put it like this: what might it look like to be asleep to the things that Jesus sleeps to, and awake to the things that Jesus is awake to? What might it look like to be asleep to the things that Jesus sleeps to, and awake to the things that Jesus is awake to? And when you say that phrase, it's not to ignore the reality of where we are or the challenges that we're facing, but I think it's a call to set our attention and our focus differently. And so let me ask you a question as we continue to think about that. How many times each day have we had conversations about COVID and the potentials and unknowns of the coming weeks and months? How many times have worries about the implications of these things consumed our thoughts, and we've checked the latest stats and articles and interpretations and predictions around upcoming guideline changes? How often do we find ourselves setting our attention on these things, meditating on them even? What might it look like to spend less time talking about and worrying about the constant changes and unknowns of this pandemic life, the stuff that's outside of our control, and more time awake to what God is doing amongst us and how he's calling us to respond? To set our attention on, to meditate on the work of Jesus amongst us and in us, and to trust God with the chaos, the stuff that's beyond our control. Can I just encourage us this morning? Let's invite Jesus to give us his perspective in this storm. And then the last piece of this puzzle, we've talked about the disciples' approach to the storm. We talked about Jesus facing the storm. And the last piece is, how did the disciples see Jesus? So I want us to just go back to this scene one more time. I want you to imagine in your minds, waves are crashing over the boat, wind is threatening to capsize them, and Jesus is asleep. And they're shouting for Jesus to get up and do something. And so just think for a moment, what are the disciples actually asking Jesus to do just now when they're wanting him to get up? What are they expecting him to do? I think maybe they were expecting him to pick up a bucket and help bail some water out of the boat. At most, maybe call some fish to drag him to the shore because they've seen him that he can move fish around in the sea. And you can almost imagine the scene. So Jesus gets up, the disciples grab a bucket to give to him and say, come on, help us out. We need your help. We're about to drown. And what happens next completely baffles them. He gets up, he ignores the bucket, turns around and starts shouting at the weather. The word that he uses for peace here, it's not shalom. It's more literally translated as shut up. Or if you're Scottish, it'd be haja wisht. He starts shouting at the weather. Even if I was getting drenched by waves and threatening to drown, that would have definitely distracted me for a moment. You know? But then what happens next, even more so, I think, he says just 3 words, peace be still. And the wind and waves are silenced. There's immediate calm. And the disciples are terrified. In fact, in N.T. Wright's translation, he describes the reaction well. He says, great fear stole over them as they saw what Jesus did. The disciples are shocked by this man they thought they knew in front of them, who can somehow say, peace, be still, to the most chaotic of nature, and it responds to him. This man that they thought they knew, the teacher that they'd given up their livelihood to follow, reveals that he's far more than they could ever comprehend. And I think Jesus realizes that because he asks them the question, why are you so afraid? I think he's saying, do you not get it yet? Do you not see who I am? And this isn't the only time this happens in the Gospels. Time and time again, these same disciples who spend all day, every day with Jesus, they get a little bit complacent. And then they discover that they've completely underestimated who Jesus is and drop down to the ground in fear and worship. It happens in chapter 9, the Transfiguration of Mark's Gospel, where Jesus reveals his full glory. They drop to the ground in worship. And it happens in chapter 16 at the resurrection, when they discover that Jesus is able to rise from the dead. They are afraid. That's the language that Mark says. And it doesn't even end there. It continues to happen to John, one of the apostles, one of the disciples, the one that is described in John's Gospel as the one who loved Jesus the most and was loved by Jesus the most. Even at the very end of his long life following Jesus, he has a moment like this. And we read about it in Revelation in chapter 1, verse 17. At the end of his life, having journeyed with Jesus for years and even leading the early church, he is so overwhelmed by the revelation of who Jesus is that he drops to the floor as though dead. That's the language that he uses. He spent his whole life pursuing and following him and still has that moment of realization that he doesn't know fully who Jesus is. If that is the case for people who saw Jesus up close, the Son of God in flesh, do you think that maybe our perspective of him is a little too small? Have we boxed in Jesus? If you think that you have a full handle on who he is, it's very likely that you have too limited a perspective. And in our context, in our time, we think that we should be able to fully understand everything we know, don't we? That is the goal of lots of academia. But I don't think that's the case with Jesus. I don't think it ever will be. I think the more that we pursue him, the bigger we realize he is. Jesus isn't just the friend who stands alongside us and helps us to keep going. He's Yahweh, Lord, Creator, and Sovereign. He is the God who says peace to the chaos and it obeys. That is the Jesus we worship this morning. The Jesus who offers himself to us. So can I just encourage you, don't let the chaos of this stormy last year to cause you to reduce your expectations of who Jesus is. He's still the same God who can say peace to storms which feel far beyond our control, and they obey him. Jesus is our real and lasting hope. And the hope that Jesus offers us is far wider and far deeper than any hope of even a vaccine or return to normality. Jesus offers a hope that echoes into eternity as he invites us to live with him. So let's pursue him afresh again today, in all of his mystery, all of his wonder and majesty. Let's worship him and remind ourselves again of who he is. Can I just pray for us to finish? Jesus, I pray that just now in this moment, whatever is of you in this last 20 or so minutes of what I shared, God, that you would make it stick. That you would be at work amongst us in this moment. And you'd be revealing yourself. Jesus, I pray for each of us that you would give us a greater perspective of who you are. And I pray that you'd inspire us and motivate us to keep pursuing you, to keep expecting that there's more of you for us to learn and to know. To not become complacent or content with what we do, but to keep seeking after more. And I pray, God, that you'd help us to continue to trust you in this storm. That you continue to remind us that that is the very best place we can put our trust and our hope in this time. I say this in your name, Jesus. Amen.